Hey everybody, welcome back to the Flying Miata Garage. Today, in part 5 of our BBR installation series, we're going to be installing some intake components, our battery, and some hard to reach stuff on the back of the engine. So let's get started. Now there is an optional step. We're opting not to do it, but I do want to go over it for you in case you do. Our next big thing to put in is our intake pieces. And to make a little bit more room for your intake, you can modify this pipe that provides fresh air to the filter. Now to do so, you're going to leave the pipe in place. You don't need to worry about removing it from the car. You'll just take a sharp utility knife, and right in this groove, you'll cut off this large flange. And that will give you just a little bit more room for your air filter. All right, now we're going to begin assembling our intake system. So first things first, we need our MAF sensor out of the stock air box. This sensor here. We'll remove this with a Phillips screwdriver, and we'll retain those screws. They're needed for the installation as well. So now that we have our MAF sensor out, we need to make one small alteration. It's got a little O-ring that seals it to the original bore. Now we're going to be sealing it against this flange, so we actually need to pop it out of that groove. So I'm using a little 90-degree pick, or maybe even just my fingernail. And let it set just outside the groove against the flange. Now we'll get ready to put it into our MAF pipe. It can only go in one way. Try to go in the other way, your screw holes will not line up. So we got that in place. Now we will take our original screws. You definitely do not want to over tighten these because you'll strip the plastic. MAF is installed. Now our next operation in the intake assembly is to add the mounting bracket to the air filter. So you can kind of reference the picture that is in the written turbo instructions on where it goes. It doesn't really matter because it is a completely symmetric filter housing other than the logo. So if you really want that logo showing, you will have to perhaps play around with the orientation, but the way we do it should show the logo properly. And just to answer some questions, this is likely for an aftermarket temp sensor, which is not part of this kit, so just ignore that. To remove these bolts, we need a 3mm Allen and an 8mm wrench. Since our bolts are only so long, we will not reuse the washers. We will install the plate. The curved edge faces toward the outlet of the filter. We will reinstall the original nuts. Now our last step on the air filter portion of the assembly is to install our rubber isolating mount. It's from bag 5. Looks like that guy there. So we'll take off one of the nuts. We will feed it through our recently installed bracket, like so. Add the nut, and we'll tighten it down with a 10mm wrench. And obviously, nylock, it's gonna really wanna twist the whole thing, so you just got to get a firm grip on that rubber bushing. And that's done. All right, now we're ready to join our air filter assembly to our MAF pipe. For this, we need our straight coupler, and we need our two 60 to 80mm clamps. I'm gonna go ahead and preload those clamps onto the coupler. Install one end onto the filter. Install one end onto the MAF pipe. Now, when we go to put this in the car, there's a good chance we will need to clock this MAF pipe relative to the filter. Because of this, I'm gonna opt to just leave these clamps loose. They're not gonna go anywhere. If you do end up snugging these clamps up for any reason, make sure that they're accessible when this is actually in the car. Otherwise, you're gonna have to pull this all out so you can reclock these clamps. Now, before we can put our air filter assembly into place, we need to move a couple things around and add a mounting point. So first things first, we're gonna take a 10mm socket. We're gonna go to the inboard ground strap, the ground strap closest to the center of the car. And we're gonna remove this bolt. We're then gonna go to our outboard ground strap. We're gonna remove this bolt. We're gonna move this ground strap to where it's shared with this one and reinstall the factory bolt. This bolt can remain left out. And you can see the way I have them clocked, the little tab will drop into that large hole. Now it's time to install our air filter mounting bracket. It is this little L-shaped bracket along with the Allen buttonhead bolts. These are both from bag 5. So I'll preload the bolt into the bracket, install it into this M8 hole in the chassis rail. Get it started. We'll tighten it down with a 5mm Allen. Want to make sure its clocking stays as so. All right, now we're ready to finally install our intake portion. I'm going to first remove the nylock nut from our isolation stud. Set that aside for now. I've also pre-installed a 50 to 70mm clamp on the end of the bellows here. Now on these, sometimes out of the bag, they're a little tight, so you may need to back them off a few turns so they actually fit over the silicone like I had to do here. We just want to make sure it doesn't fall off. And just as a reminder, these clamps here are still loose. I'll tighten them once I have all the clocking determined. So I'm going to get this fed in and make sure my stud goes into my bracket hole. There it goes. So felt that go in. So now we'll line up our MAF pipe into the compressor inlet hose. See, I might need to loosen this even a little bit more. Okay, there's a few things we need to focus on as we tighten things down. We want to make sure that things are clocked appropriately and that nothing is in a position to where it's going to pinch or rub on anything that could result in damage. Specifically thinking the air filter against the radiator wires down here, or the cooling fan wires. We want to make sure those aren't touching. We want to make sure we have enough room for our MAF plug, which is just dropped down over here. So we might as well plug that in so we can make sure it's not going to hit the fan. And then just check for any other areas where it looks like things could be rubbing. You may just have to shift and clock things as necessary to get things to fit well. All right, now I have things clocked the way I want it. So the first thing I need to do is install my stud nut. It's going to be very hard to see me do this. Once I have this installed, I will then move on to my hose clamps. And along the way, I'm going to just recheck everything for contact and make sure everything is how it needs to be to avoid damage. Now that I have that on, I will tighten it down with a 10mm socket. And after a long while of slowly turning that nut, it is tight. So apologies, that is a kind of a pain to deal with. But now we're ready to tighten our clamps. Got my driver loaded up with a 7mm socket. Again, paying attention to where things are positioned. Let's rotate clamps, and none of these need to be super tight, especially on this plastic MAF pipe. You may have noticed there are metallic inserts on the ID. That is to ensure that things don't get crushed, but still, do not just go to town on these. Snug is good enough. All right, now I have all of my clamps tightened up, and there's a couple areas where I need to pay attention to. The first and the obvious one to see is I'm a little bit close of this pipe to the water neck outlet. So I'm gonna just keep my eye on that. As we install other components like the diverter valve, that could begin to pull that away and keep it stationary. The one concern I do have is our top wiring piece on our fan shroud. It is kind of getting rested on by that filter. So to resolve that, I'm going to unclip it from its base, and I will just zip tie it to the next mount down. Now our next step in the installation is to reinstall our battery. Yes, we are reusing the stock battery, but it does have to fit in a different orientation. Because of that, we have our battery tray. So a new tray, new top mount, new J-bolts, and the hardware to get everything installed. So, first things first, we got to adapt the positive and negative terminals to reach where the battery is now going to reside. So come on over to the car and we'll show you how that's done. All right, over here at the car, we need to relocate our terminals where they're going to reside. So starting with the positive terminal, I'm gonna remove this shielding. So with this little tab, spring it back, pull straight up, it's out of the way. So we're gonna use the extension bar to relocate the positive terminal to where it will reside in the car. So taking a 12mm socket, I'm gonna undo this nut. I'm gonna take it and the positive clamp over to the bench. So now we have our pieces over here at the bench, and I will show you how they assemble together. So I'm going to take the extension bar, slide it over the stud of the positive mount using the stock nut from the positive mount. We'll get that tightened up. Oop, hold on to it. Now we want to add our new protective sleeve cover. Now this cover, when it's cold, can be pretty hard and pretty difficult to work with. So if you're finding yours hard to work with, you might hit it with the heat gun or a blow dryer just for a little bit, and that will help soften it up. So then we'll stick the bus bar through. And it's a little bit of a stretch, but we'll get it pulled over like that. Now the end result will be something like this. So when all is said and done, that way we're fully protected, but we can still use our stock battery. We'll then use our bolt, spring washer, and nut to attach the extension bar to the remaining portion of the terminal within the car. We'll do that now, and then we'll talk about the ground side. All right, so we have our extended piece. Let's get the nut removed, spring washer removed. I'll slide that underneath the existing terminal. Slide the bolt through. You know what? I might actually put the spring washer on this side. Add our nut. Now to tighten this down, we need a 13mm socket and a 13mm wrench to hold the nut. The last step is to re-add our factory positive terminal cover. And if you want to get really creative to just make this look a little cleaner, you could probably notch the front end of this so it slides over the bar a little bit better, but we'll leave that up to this customer. Now we need to relocate our negative terminal. Our negative terminal will end up being way over here, and we're starting out over here. So we need to separate the negative leads from these two connectors. Now you can try to separate these connectors from the fuse box, but they're kind of a pain. You'll end up just scratching up the fuse box. So I usually recommend just cutting the tape to the connectors or the mounting tabs, so then we can extend that over. Now we can take our negative lead, come all the way around, and that will end up reaching over here. So we'll just move it out of the way for now, which means kind of maybe just up and behind the throttle body, just so it doesn't get in our way. We're now going to pull this hose out of the way. We just loosely put it on the throttle body for now, so it kept everything clean and orderly. But we'll need it moved to deal with the battery tray. All right, now we're ready to install our battery tray. Now, if you look at the bottom side, you'll notice there is the spacer that is welded into place. That is for a specific reason. If you come take a look over here, there's a section of the cross member here that is recessed. And this hole right here, we're using that hole, but we need to space up so we don't have a gap. So let's drop our tray in there in the correct orientation and line up the holes. And then we'll take our two countersink bolts that were included with the kit, get those started. Okay, we got those started, and we will get those tightened down with a 5mm Allen. Now I'll take the battery, and I need to pay attention to the orientation. Positive terminal goes toward the driver's side, negative terminal toward the passenger side, and terminals toward the front of the car. This hose doesn't belong there, that's why we're having a little bit of a struggle. So that will come up and over. Battery's in its tray. All right, now we have our battery tie-down bracket preloaded with the supplied J-bolts. So we'll get that installed over the battery. Careful not to touch the terminals because everything here is metal. So and we'll snug things up with an 11mm socket. But first we got to fish the J-hooks into place. Snug is good. Just make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Lay our hose back over where it needs to go. Now we're ready to put our terminals on. I'm only going to hook up the positive for now since we're still working on the car. We don't want our battery hooked up. So for the positive, let me first move the negative out of the way. So it's been moved over here, and I'm going to kind of just drop it down to where it's not in the way of the positive. Now we'll take our positive and we will get it in place. We'll tighten that up with a 10mm socket. Okay. Then we'll push our cover down over so we are safe. Now that we have our battery mostly in place, we're ready to install this intercooler pipe onto the throttle body. We're using one of the 50 to 70 millimeter clamps. Might need to loosen it just a hair first. All right, the next step in our process is to install our dump valve or blow-off valve, bypass valve, whatever you want to call it. So we need 2 of the 20 to 32 millimeter clamps and the valve itself. Let's go over to the car and get it installed. Now this is directional. It only really works in this situation one way. So we want the vacuum line to be pointed out toward the passenger side, not forward. So we'll slide our clamp on first. Then we'll install our valve. And we may need to loosen our clamps to get them in place. Then tighten them back down. Now we need to provide a vacuum line to that bypass valve. Now I'm going to do things a specific way, and I'll tell you the reasons why. You may always do things differently, that's fine. I'm going to start by removing the vanity cover off the engine. Set it to the side for now. I've got our vacuum line and the T, as well as a couple of these small clamps. So I'm going to first plug the vacuum line into the dump valve or bypass valve, and I'm going to route it the way I would normally route it. And again, you may find a different way, looks better or functions better for you. We are eventually going to have our breather line coming around and doing a loop right here. So this kind of runs parallel to that. I will then have things go underneath the vanity cover. And you can see our hose just reaches the backside of our intake manifold to booster line hose. Now, if you notice this hose, it has a sheathing from starting here and ending here. That makes it a little tricky to get our clamps on. So what I'll do is I will disconnect the backside of this hose from the intake manifold, which we would need for a later step anyway. I can then pull that hose out and access the section that doesn't have a sheathing, where I can install our T. And that's where our vacuum line will connect. Once our vanity cover is on, you'll barely see that vacuum line, where if we installed it over here, you would see it. So now I've got a pair of pliers. Let's disconnect that hose. Got that broken loose. So now let's pull that off. We can now fish it out to where we have access to it. Then taking my hose cutters, we might use a utility knife. We'll make a cut. We will install our clamps on either side of the cut. Then we'll install our T. It is a little bit of a snug fit, so you may use some soapy water if you need to. And like some of our other clamps, you may need to loosen them slightly first before they can really go into place. So that will go into the back of the intake manifold, so we want our vacuum line pointed that way. So now when we put that back in place, you can see our hose barb is pointing the right direction. But I am going to leave this up for now because we eventually have to do some business on the backside of the manifold, and this will just be in the way. All right, now the next thing on our list is to replace the map sensor. Now we're over at a standalone engine because it's going to be impossible to show you this on the car itself. So what you're looking at is the back side of the engine. So normally there's a firewall right here. So we will have a little pocket of access right here. This port that's taped up, that's where our vacuum hose from our intake manifold to our booster line is that we just disconnected previously. And that's why we left it undone, is so we have a little bit more access to reaching our hand back here. So what we're looking for, this is the map sensor. So we are going to have to unplug it and remove this T25 Torx bit. So to fish our hands down there with a tool and get it undone. Now, you might say, well, why not just get it from the bottom? Because you can't. There is so much stuff right here, including the starter, that it is impossible to get here from the bottom as well. So this is just the first thing that we're gonna have to get to from this side. We've got to remove the stock map sensor and install the supplied map sensor. So we put it in like so, tighten our Torx bit and plug it in. Don't forget that last part. All right, now I've shown you the replacement of the map sensor. There is another task that we have on the back side of the engine, and that is the PCV hose. The reason why we need to address it is under normal circumstances, it works just fine. But as soon as you add boost, there is the potential for it to blow off. Let me show you why. The PCV hose is this little C-shaped hose here, and it goes between the PCV valve and the intake manifold. Let me pop it off. Now the PCV has a barb, but the intake manifold does not. And that is where it's likely to pop off. So now let's go over to the bench and I'll show you what we do about it. All right, our solution is to add a clamp. Now this clamp is from bag 1. It's the only shiny clamp, so should be easy to find. Now I do have a little bit of a trick to getting this on, because it's nearly impossible to get pliers back down in there, and you'll shred your fingertips if you are trying to pinch this with your fingers. So we got the clamp from our hardware bin from this installation. I have an M6 bolt and an M6 nut, both of them flanged. Got a pair of pliers, 10mm socket, and I'm going to be using the handle on my 1/4" ratchet. You might find something equivalent, and I'll kind of show you what we're looking for here. The aim of this trick is to pinch the spring tabs of the clamp in between the flanges of the nut and bolt. Now to go straight at it, it's likely to pop off as you're tightening things down. That's why I'm going to use the pliers and the ratchet handle. So I will pinch it till it's all the way open. Slide it over my handle, or you can find something equivalent to where it's almost all the way open. You can then take the nut and bolt, and it's going to kind of try to walk off the side of the clamp on you, so you got to take some care to keep it centered, and then you can work it off the handle. Now you have a fully open clamp. You do want to be careful, because if this does pop out, it could shoot across the room. You don't want to lose it, and you don't want to hit yourself in the eye. Now, you do have to be delicate with this. You are going to be reaching back to where you can't see, so you want to make sure and not bump it in any way that would cause it to open up prematurely. Now I have my hose popped off, so I will load it on to the bottom end of that hose, and once I'm confident everything is in a good position, I would pull the bolt off, and now my clamp is sprung onto the hose. So now that I've got the clamp loaded onto the hose with my little spring mechanism, I will then reach back and install it where it goes. Now remember, there's a firewall right here, which means I can't just peek around and see it. So I'll kind of imitate what I would be doing on the car. Just kind of have to feel around down here, find out where the barb is. All right, so that feels like it's all the way on. So now I'll reach down there, feel around, find that bolt, and pull it off. And then pull it back out of the way. And then I'd have to connect the upper end to the PCV hose. Careful pressing onto the PCV hose. If you push too hard, you can break it, so you want to just give it a little wiggle as you press. Now those last two steps that I just covered on the back side of the shop engine, I showed you there because you're not going to be able to see me do it on this engine. So I just wanted to give you that visual, but now I need to do it for real on this engine, so now watch me struggle. So now as I reach back here, the easiest point of access is just across the top here. It's a little bit more difficult on cars that have shock tower braces because you have these additional flanges. But usually just between here, or if you can stick your left hand here, but usually you can get everything from this side. There's not a whole lot of access from the bottom. I mean, pretty much zero, so highly recommend going this route. I just unplugged the map. Got the bolt. Got the map sensor. All right, got the old map sensor out. Now I'm ready to put the new one in. Now I did take just a drop of motor oil and added it to the O-ring so it will slide in nice and easy. Screws started. Sensor is in. Now we'll reach back there and grab our hose. Okay, so we'll load up our clamp. All right, just doing a final check, make sure that my map sensor plug is seated and that my PCV hose is in the right place and the clamp is in the right place and everything feels good. Now it is also a good idea to stick a mirror back there just to double check so you can see it. That way you're not going just on feel. All right, now that we've checked everything out and everything looks good, we can finally install our booster line and then install the line that runs up to our bypass valve. So we'll do that now. All right, as I was tucking my line, I realized it wasn't really going to work the way I had it routed originally. So I'm gonna mess around with it a little bit. So I now have it routed in front of the water neck here. I need to rotate a couple clamps just so they don't chafe on it, but I think this routing is gonna work quite a bit better. So I'll get all that situated now, and then we can install our vanity cover. All right, now I am happy with my routing. You don't have to have your routing look exactly like this. The key is to make sure that your vacuum line is protected, that it's not gonna get pinched, chafed on, or cut. It does also look like I'm just leaving some of this just dangling, and for now I am. I'm going to be installing some other components in this area, and once those are installed, I'll get this neatly secured along with them using some zip ties, so we will end up with a clean result. All right, now the next step in our process is to add our breather line. So we got the breather line and the P-clamp from bag 3, and we have our 10mm line joiner from bag 7. We'll also need a 12mm socket for this. So we'll head over to the car and get this installed. All right, first things first, we got our hose union, and we'll install that into our compressor inlet hose. So if you look at the compressor inlet hose, just forward of the compressor, there's this little noodle. We'll stick that right in. Now we'll take our supplied hose, join that together. Now you can leave a little opening like that, that's no big deal. Or, for a slightly cleaner look, you can push that all the way together. Now we'll start routing this where it needs to go. Now you can see if I leave this full length, it has a little bit of excess. So I might consider trimming it down a little bit. So we'll take a couple inches off of there. Now we'll install it onto our valve cover. Now the last step in this is to secure the hose. So with the provided clamp, we're gonna mount it on one of these cam actuator bolts. So I'm gonna choose this one here. So with a 12mm socket, I'll get that pulled out. Get our P-clamp installed on the hose. Because it's kind of pulling it into that corner, I might actually lift that up a little bit, and that just gives it a better appearance there. Now, if we wanted to, we could trim this a little bit further, but I think I'm happy with that. All right, now that we have that hose installed, it's a good idea to give it one final once-over. Just check its routing, make sure that it's not going to interfere with anything that will chafe into it or pinch it. All right, everybody, that does it for video 5 of our video series, installing a BBR Turbo kit. Be sure to join us for video 6, where we'll be covering the final hard part installation. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. And if you have any questions during your installation, be sure to give our CSR department a call. We'd love to help you out. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.